Please, ma'am, we need to get out of this cold. We're freezing.
All right, get in here. Hurry up.
Thank you.
Snow slammed against the glass like shattered bone. 70-year-old Martha Higgins sat alone, clutching her shotgun. Outside her isolated Wyoming cabin, 20 massive figures emerged from the whiteout. Leather jackets, death head patches, Hell's Angels. Letting them inside meant risking everything, but turning them away meant certain murder by ice. The blizzard of January 2019 didn't just hit the Wyoming plains, it swallowed them whole. Temperatures plummeted to a staggering 30 degrees below zero, with wind chills tearing across Interstate 80 that could freeze exposed skin solid in under 4 minutes. For Martha Higgins, the storm was just another bitter reminder of her isolation. It had been 3 years since her husband, Arthur, lost his brutal fight with pancreatic cancer. They had built this modest ranch house together, nestled 40 miles outside of Cheyenne, far from the prying eyes of the city. Now, it was just Martha, a dying, wood-burning stove, and a mountain of medical debt that was slowly suffocating her. At 9:45 p.m., the power grid failed. The lights flickered twice, then died, plunging the house into a suffocating darkness. Martha sighed, striking a match to light the kerosene lamp on her dining table. She wrapped Arthur's old wool hunting jacket tighter around her frail shoulders. Then, she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a guttural, mechanical death rattle. The sound of heavy V-twin engines choking on ice and freezing oil. Martha crept to the frosted living room window and rubbed a small circle in the condensation. Through the blinding sheets of white snow, she saw headlights dying one by one at the end of her long, unpaved driveway. Massive figures were dismounting heavy motorcycles, slipping and stumbling in knee-deep drifts. When they began marching toward her porch, panic seized her throat. Martha lived in a county where folks kept to themselves, and the local sheriff's department was easily an hour away in good weather. Tonight, they might as well be on the moon. She hurried to the hall closet, her trembling hands retrieving Arthur's .2 gauge Remington shotgun. She cracked the chamber, ensuring 2 buckshot shells were loaded, and clicked the safety off. Boom, boom, boom. The heavy oak front door shuddered under the force of massive fists. "Help! Lady, please! We got men dying out here!" A voice roared over the howling wind. It was deep, frantic, and rough like sandpaper. Martha hesitated. She unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door just a few inches, leaving the chain engaged. The barrel of her shotgun rested perfectly in the gap. Standing on her porch was a giant of a man. Ice clung to a thick, graying beard that reached his chest. He wore a heavy leather vest over a frozen denim jacket. But it was the unmistakable red and white patch stitched onto his chest that made Martha's blood run colder than the Wyoming air. Hell's Angels. Wyoming nomads. She knew the reputation. Everyone did. Outlaws. The 1%ers. "Move along," Martha stammered, trying to keep the terror out of her voice. "I'm armed. You boys need to get back on the highway." The giant raised his hand slowly, palms open, showing he meant no harm. "Ma'am, my name is Richard. They call me Big Rick. I swear to God, on my mother's grave, we don't want no trouble, but we got 20 bikes out there that just froze solid. I got a kid, 21 years old. His lips are blue and he ain't making sense no more. If you don't let us in, we are going to die on your porch." Martha looked past him. Gathered in the punishing winds were 19 other men. They were huddled together, wrapping their leather-clad arms around each other to share whatever failing body heat they had left. One of them, a much smaller man, was slung over the shoulders of a burly biker, completely limp. They were Hell's Angels, but right now, they were just freezing boys. Arthur used to say, "You can't control who knocks on your door, Martha, but you can control if you act like a Christian when you open it." With a heavy exhale, Martha dropped the shotgun, slid the chain free, and pulled the heavy oak door wide open. "Get in here!" she barked, her maternal instincts instantly overriding her terror. "All of you! Hurry!" They piled in. The hallway instantly filled with the smell of wet leather, exhaust fumes, cheap tobacco, and desperate, freezing sweat. 20 full-patched Hell's Angels stood awkwardly in Martha's meticulously decorated floral living room, dripping melting snow onto her hand-hooked rugs. They looked like wolves trapped in a dollhouse. "Put him by the stove. Now," Martha ordered, pointing to the limp young man. Big Rick and another biker, a heavily tattooed man introduced only as Snake, laid the unconscious boy gently on the rug. "His name is Tommy," Big Rick said, his massive voice shaking slightly. "He's just a prospect. He didn't have the right gear for this." Martha knelt beside the boy. His skin was pale gray, his lips a terrifying shade of violet. Severe hypothermia. She didn't hesitate. "You!" She pointed at Snake. "Get his wet boots and jacket off. The rest of you, strip your outer layers. If you stay in wet leather, you'll freeze from the inside out." The men, terrifying outlaws who bowed to no authority, immediately obeyed the 70-year-old widow. Martha ran to her linen closet, pulling out every quilt, wool blanket, and towel she owned. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron kettle from the cold electric stove and shoved it directly onto the roaring wood-burning fire in the living room. For the next 2 hours, the secluded cabin transformed into a triage center. Martha moved with a frantic, focused energy, distributing dry blankets and pouring scalding instant coffee into every mug, glass, and bowl she could find in her cabinets. She sat beside young Tommy, massaging his freezing hands and forcing warm broth past his chattering teeth. Slowly, the color began to return to the young biker's face. He coughed, opening bleary eyes to see a grandmotherly woman wiping his forehead with a warm cloth. "You're in Wyoming, sweetheart," Martha whispered softly, seeing the confusion in his eyes. "You're safe." Big Rick stood by the window, watching the storm rage outside. He turned to Martha, his hardened face softening in the dim glow of the firelight. "You saved his life, ma'am. You saved a few of ours." "Nobody dies on my porch," Martha replied simply, gathering empty mugs. But the night was far from over, and the storm was about to trap them together in ways none of them expected. By 1 a.m., the wind was shrieking like a wounded animal. The snow had completely buried the first-floor windows, creating an impenetrable wall of white ice around the cabin. Inside, the temperature was slowly dropping, entirely dependent on the single wood stove in the center of the room. 20 massive men were sprawled across Martha's living room and hallway floors. Some were snoring heavily, exhausted from their brush with death. Others sat quietly, polishing their boots or staring into the dancing orange flames. Martha sat in Arthur's old rocking chair, sipping tea. She felt an odd sense of surreal calm. Here she was, an elderly widow, completely cut off from civilization, hosting a notorious motorcycle club. Yet, there was a profound respect in the room. They spoke in hushed tones, careful not to curse in front of her. Whenever she stood to add a log to the fire, 2 bikers instantly leaped up to do it for her. Big Rick pulled a small wooden stool near her rocking chair, sitting down carefully so it wouldn't splinter under his weight. "You got a lot of grit, Miss Martha," Rick said quietly. "Most folks would have shot us through the door, or called the state troopers." "The troopers wouldn't have made it," Martha replied, looking at the fire. "And I don't believe in letting men freeze, even men who wear what you wear." Rick looked down at his leather vest, tracing the edge of the Death Head logo. "We're a brotherhood. We take care of our own because the rest of the world turned its back on us. We were riding from California up to South Dakota. One of our charter presidents. He passed away. Heart attack. We were trying to beat the storm to make his funeral. Obviously, we miscalculated." "I know what it's like to bury someone you love," Martha said softly, her eyes drifting to the mantel, where a framed photograph of Arthur smiled back at her. "It makes you do reckless things. Like riding into a blizzard." Rick followed her gaze. "Your husband?" "Arthur. 35 years. He was a good man. Worked at the local lumber mill until his back gave out. Then, the cancer came." While Martha spoke, Snake, the lean, heavily tattooed biker who had helped carry Tommy, was pacing near the kitchen counter, trying to find a signal on his cell phone. His eyes fell upon a stack of stark white envelopes resting near the sink. The top letter was open, its contents stamped with brutal, bold red ink. "Final notice of foreclosure. Pioneer State Bank of Wyoming. Snake read the numbers visible on the page. $84,320. Past, due. Eviction scheduled for February 15th. Snake's jaw tightened. He quietly picked up the paper, walked back to the living room, and handed it directly to Big Rick. Rick read the document in silence, his thick eyebrows furrowed as he looked from the paper to the sweet, frail woman sitting in the rocking chair, who was currently wrapping another quilt around a sleeping biker. "Miss Martha," Rick said, his voice dropping an octave. He held up the letter. "What is this?" Martha froze. The color drained from her face, replaced by a flush of deep embarrassment. She quickly stood and snatched the letter from his hand, her hands trembling. "That is private," she snapped, a sudden defensive anger flaring in her chest. "You have no right to snoop in my home." "I apologize, ma'am," Rick said quickly, holding his hands up. "Snake didn't mean to pry. But they're taking your house?" Martha sank back into her rocking chair, suddenly looking incredibly old and exhausted. The secret she had carried alone for 2 years had just been exposed to a room full of strangers. The fight left her completely. "Arthur's treatments," she whispered, tears finally pooling in the corners of her eyes. "Insurance didn't cover the experimental chemo. We took out a second mortgage, then a third. When he died, the income stopped. I've been selling off furniture and farm equipment just to keep the lights on, but the bank, Pioneer State, they don't care about Arthur. They just want their money. I have 3 weeks left before the sheriff comes to change the locks." The room went dead silent. The snoring had stopped. The 20 men were awake, listening intensely. "Where will you go?" young Tommy asked from his spot on the rug, his voice raspy. "I don't know," Martha admitted, staring at her hands. "A state facility, maybe. I don't have any family left." Big Rick looked around the room. He made eye contact with Snake, then with the other 18 men. A silent, invisible conversation happened in that single moment. A grim, collective understanding passed between the members of the Wyoming nomads. $84,000 is a lot of money, Miss Martha, Rick said slowly. "It's a mountain," she replied bitterly. "And I'm just an old woman with a shovel." The rest of the night passed in a somber quiet. The storm raged outside, but inside, a different kind of pressure was building. At 7 a.m., the howling wind finally broke. The morning sun pierced through the clouds, reflecting blindingly off the 6-foot snowdrifts. In the distance, the faint, deep rumble of county snowplows could be heard scraping. Interstate 80. The bikers mobilized quickly. They stepped outside into the freezing morning air, using shovels and pieces of scrap wood from Martha's shed to dig their frozen Harleys out of the icy tombs. By 9 a.m., through sheer mechanical willpower and a lot of cursing, the 20 massive engines roared back to life, spitting thick white smoke into the Wyoming sky. Martha stood on her porch, wrapped in Arthur's coat, watching them prepare to leave. Big Rick walked up the wooden steps. He didn't look like a frozen, desperate man anymore. He looked like the president of a notorious outlaw motorcycle club. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound club coin, pressing it into Martha's palm. "You kept us breathing, Miss Martha. You treated us like men when most folks treat us like stray dogs," Rick said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intense, unreadable fire. "Drive safe, Rick. Don't try to outrun the ice next time." She offered a weak smile. Rick turned to walk down the steps, then paused, looking back over his heavy leather shoulder. "We got a saying in our club, ma'am. Angels never forget a debt." He walked to his bike, kicked it into gear, and led the roaring pack down the snowy driveway, disappearing onto the freshly plowed highway. Martha went back inside her cold, quiet house. She placed the heavy club coin on the mantel next to Arthur's photo. She was alone again, with nothing but the ticking clock counting down the days until the bank took her home. She assumed she would never see the Hells Angels again. She was incredibly, unimaginably wrong. The 3 weeks following the blizzard dissolved in a blur of cardboard boxes and packing tape. The heavy club coin Big Rick had left on the mantel sat there, a silent observer to the dismantling of Martha Higgins's life. The brief warmth she had felt harboring the Wyoming nomads quickly faded into the freezing reality of her impending eviction. Martha did not give up without a fight. 2 weeks before the deadline, she had driven her rusted 1998 Ford Ranger into downtown Cheyenne, her best Sunday dress pressed and her pride swallowed. She sat for 3 hours in the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned lobby of Pioneer State Bank, waiting for an audience with the regional vice president, a man named Harrison Cole. When she was finally allowed into his glass-walled office, the encounter was mercifully brief and exceptionally cruel. Cole was a man in his late 30s whose tailored suits cost more than Martha's annual grocery budget. He didn't look at her when she spoke. He looked at his monitor. Martha pleaded her case. She explained about Arthur's cancer, the predatory interest rates on the secondary medical loans, and asked for just a 6-month extension to try and sell off the remaining acreage of the property. "Mrs. Higgins," Cole had said, his voice as smooth and frictionless as ice. "The bank is not a charity. We extended a line of credit based on collateral. That collateral is the property. The grace period expired 90 days ago. I suggest you use these final 2 weeks to secure assisted living arrangements. The sheriff will be there on the 15th at noon to change the locks. Please ensure the property is swept and all fixtures remain intact." That was it. 35 years of marriage, of building a home log by log, reduced to a keystroke on a banker's terminal. The morning of February 15th broke crisp and painfully bright. The snow from the great blizzard had hardened into dirty, crystalline crusts along the edges of the driveway. Martha stood in the center of her empty living room. The hooked rugs were rolled up. The floral armchairs had been sold to a second-hand dealer for a fraction of their worth. All she had left were 2 battered Samsonite suitcases and a single cardboard box containing Arthur's ashes, his military medals, and a few photo albums. At exactly 11:45 a.m., the crunch of tires on gravel shattered the silence. Martha looked out the window. 2 vehicles pulled up to the house. The first was a black Lincoln Navigator. The second was the familiar tan and brown cruiser of the county sheriff. Sheriff William Boyd stepped out of the cruiser. He was a local man, nearing retirement, who had known Arthur and Martha for 2 decades. He walked with his head down, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a duty he clearly despised. Behind him, stepping out of the Lincoln in a pristine cashmere overcoat, was Harrison Cole. The banker had come personally. It wasn't standard protocol, but the Higgins property was a prime piece of real estate, and Cole was notoriously fastidious about securing high-value assets for immediate auction. Martha opened the front door before they could knock. She stood on the porch, wrapped in Arthur's wool hunting jacket, her suitcases flanked by her side. Sheriff Boyd stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps and removed his Stetson. He looked physically ill. "Martha, God, I am so sorry. You know I don't want to be doing this." "It's not your fault, Bill," Martha said softly, offering him a sad, fragile smile. "You're just doing your job. I don't blame you." Harrison Cole stepped past the sheriff, holding a clipboard loaded with legal documents. He surveyed the empty porch, then peeked through the front window, checking for any last-minute vandalism. Satisfied, he clicked a silver pen and held it out to her. "Mrs. Higgins, I need your signature here, acknowledging the formal transfer of the property and the forfeiture of the keys. You have until 1 p.m. to remove your vehicles from the premises before they are towed at your expense." Martha stared at the pen. Her hand trembled as she reached out to take it. The pen felt like a lead weight. This was it. The absolute end of the line. She was 70 years old, widowed, broke, and technically homeless. A tear finally broke free, tracing a hot path down her wrinkled cheek. She touched the tip of the pen to the paper. Then, the ground began to vibrate. It was subtle at first, a faint tremor in the wooden floorboards of the porch. Sheriff Boyd frowned, looking down at his boots. The water in a leftover puddle near the driveway began to ripple in concentric circles. "Is that a freight train?" Cole muttered, annoyed by the distraction, adjusting his cashmere coat. "The tracks are 5 miles away." "It ain't a train," Sheriff Boyd said, his voice suddenly tight. His hand instinctively drifted toward his radio. The vibration intensified into a low, guttural thrum that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. It sounded like a thunderstorm rolling directly across the earth, a mechanical roar that chewed through the cold Wyoming air. The noise grew deafening, drowning out the wind. Martha lowered the pen, She knew that sound. Over the crest of the hill, at the far end of the mile-long, unpaved driveway, a single motorcycle appeared. It was a massive, custom-built Harley Davidson, painted matte black, its chrome catching the midday sun. Behind it came two more. Then 4. Then the horizon tore open. A tidal wave of leather, denim, and heavy machinery poured over the ridge. They rode in a perfectly disciplined 2x2 formation, an endless, roaring serpent of motorcycles stretching as far as the eye could see. The noise was apocalyptic. The deep, synchronized thudding of 1,000 V-twin engines shook the snow from the pine trees and rattled the glass in Martha's windows. Harrison Cole stepped back, his eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated panic. "Sheriff, what the hell is this? Call for backup." Boyd just stared, completely paralyzed. Backup? From who? The National Guard? There's got to be. Jesus, there's 1,000 of them. They kept coming. Hundreds upon hundreds of heavy cruisers filled the driveway, spilling over into the snow-covered pastures, encircling the property in a massive ring of iron and exhaust. Men and women dismounted, their cuts adorned with the notorious death head patch. It wasn't just the Wyoming nomads. There were rockers from California, Nevada, South Dakota, Texas, and New York. The Hells Angels had answered a call. The engines shut off in waves, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in the air, broken only by the sharp pings of cooling metal and the crunch of heavy boots on gravel. From the front of the pack, the giant figure of Big Rick stepped forward. Big Rick looked exactly as he had 3 weeks ago, though absent the freezing ice in his beard. He walked with a heavy, deliberate stride up the driveway, flanked by Snake and the young prospect, Tommy, who now looked healthy and fiercely loyal. The sea of bikers parted for them in absolute silence. 1,000 hardened outlaws stood shoulder to shoulder on Martha's lawn, their arms crossed, their eyes fixed on the man in the cashmere coat. Sheriff Boyd rested his hand nervously on his duty belt but took a smart step backward. Harrison Cole, however, was trembling so violently his clipboard rattled against his leg. Big Rick stopped at the base of the porch stairs. He looked up at Martha, who was gripping the wooden railing, tears now flowing freely down her face. Rick reached up and tapped the brim of his leather cap. "Afternoon, Miss Martha," Rick rumbled. "Hope we aren't interrupting." Martha let out a wet, choked laugh. "You're a little late for coffee, Rick." Rick smiled, a flash of white teeth in a weathered face. Then, his expression hardened into granite as he turned to Harrison Cole. "You the bank?" Rick asked. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Cole swallowed hard, trying to summon the authority he had wielded so easily against an elderly widow just 5 minutes prior. "I am Harrison Cole, Vice President of Pioneer State. This is a private eviction. You are trespassing. All of you." Rick didn't blink. He reached into his heavy leather jacket and pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper. It was the foreclosure notice Snake had spotted weeks ago. "Notice says the debt is $84,320, payable in full to satisfy the lien," Rick read, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent yard. He looked at Cole. "Notice also says she has until 1 p.m. today to settle." Cole looked at his Rolex. "It is 11:55 a.m., and she doesn't have the money. Now, you need to clear this property or the sheriff will arrest you." Sheriff Boyd aggressively cleared his throat, subtly shaking his head at Cole, silently begging the banker not to antagonize 1,000 outlaws. "We know she don't have the money," Snake chimed in from behind Rick, a wicked grin spreading across his tattooed face. "That's why we brought it." Rick snapped his fingers. Young Tommy stepped forward. He was carrying a massive, heavy-duty olive-green canvas duffel bag. He hauled it up the stairs and dropped it directly at Harrison Cole's Italian leather shoes. The bag hit the wooden porch with a resounding, heavy thud. "What is this?" Cole stammered, taking a step back, as if the bag contained a bomb. "We are a brotherhood," Rick said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "When I put the word out to the charters that the woman who saved my prospect's life was getting thrown in the snow by some suit, the hat got passed around. Turns out, bikers respect a debt a hell of a lot more than bankers do." Rick reached down and unzipped the duffel bag. Inside were stacks of cash. It wasn't crisp, organized $100 bills. It was an absolute chaotic mess of legal tender. There were rubber-banded stacks of 20s, crumpled 10s, thousands of $1 bills, rolls of quarters, and Ziploc bags full of dimes and nickels. It was the collective pocket emptying of 1,000 outlaws across the United States. $84,320, Rick said, pointing a massive, calloused finger at the bag, plus another 20 grand to cover her property taxes for the next decade. All legally acquired, all federally backed U.S. currency. Cole stared in horror at the mountain of crumpled, dirty cash. I can't accept this. This is ridiculous. I'm not counting all of this. You're a bank. Rick took one step up the stairs, suddenly towering over Cole, his chest inches from the banker's face. The atmosphere on the porch dropped 10 degrees. Your notice says payable in full. That's legal tender. If you refuse it, you invalidate the debt. So, I suggest you get on your knees, start counting, and write the lady her receipt. Or, I can have my 1,000 brothers here help you count it. A low, threatening murmur rippled through the crowd of bikers. 1,000 men shifted their weight, leather creaking in unison. Cole looked at the crowd, then at Sheriff Boyd. He's right, Harrison, Boyd said, unable to hide the massive, vindicated smirk spreading across his face. Under federal law, you have to accept legal tender for a debt if offered before the deadline. Better start counting. I'll stick around to make sure you don't lose any quarters. Defeated, utterly humiliated, and terrified out of his mind, the vice president of Pioneer State Bank slowly sank to his knees on the wooden porch. He awkwardly pulled a stack of wrinkled $1 bills from the canvas bag and began, with shaking hands, to count. Big Rick walked past the kneeling banker and approached Martha. She was sobbing now, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the miracle standing in her yard. She dropped the pen and threw her arms around the giant biker. Rick gently patted her back. I told you, Miss Martha, he whispered gently. Angels never forget a debt. Martha looked over his shoulder at the sprawling sea of motorcycles, the terrifying men who had become her salvation. Now, Rick pulled back, smiling warmly at her. Tommy over there has been dreaming about your instant coffee for 3 weeks. Do you think you could put the kettle on? The next 6 hours transformed Martha Higgins's front yard into a surreal, chaotic carnival of leather and chrome. Harrison Cole, the regional vice president of Pioneer State Bank, remained on his knees on the freezing wooden planks of the porch. His pristine $1,000 cashmere overcoat was smeared with dirt and melting snow. His soft, manicured hands, used to tapping on keyboards and signing digital foreclosure approvals, were now coated in a thick layer of gray grime from handling thousands of circulated coins and crumpled, oil-stained dollar bills. Surrounding him was an audience of 1,000 Hell's Angels. They didn't riot. They didn't break a single window or crush a single flower bed. Instead, they set up a massive, impromptu camp. Heavy coolers were unstrapped from the backs of touring bikes. Sandwiches were passed around. A burly biker named Dutch, wearing a New York charter rocker, pulled an acoustic guitar from a sidecar and began picking a slow, bluesy melody that drifted over the snowy plains. Sheriff William Boyd had retrieved a canvas folding chair from the trunk of his cruiser. He sat at the bottom of the porch stairs, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand, watching Cole count with an expression of profound, unfiltered satisfaction. Every time the banker sighed or slowed down, Boyd would lean forward and tap his watch. Keep it moving, Harrison, Boyd drawled lazily. Sunsets at 5:30. Don't want you catching a chill. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was entirely different. The suffocating dread that had plagued Martha for years had evaporated, replaced by the frenetic warmth of a crowded kitchen. Tommy, the young prospect whose life she had saved weeks prior, was acting as her unofficial sous chef. Together, they boiled pot after pot of water, brewing industrial quantities of cheap instant coffee and hot chocolate. Big Rick stood leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen, his massive frame taking up most of the space. He watched Martha move with a renewed, youthful energy. You didn't have to do this, Rick, Martha said, her voice shaking with emotion as she stirred a pitcher of warm milk. This is a fortune. I can never repay this club. Rick took a slow sip from a chipped ceramic mug, You already paid, Miss Martha. In this world, most folks look at the patch on our back and treat us like monsters. You looked at a bunch of dying men and treated us like sons. That kind of respect? You can't put a price tag on that. The money was the easy part. Passing the hat through the charters took about 3 days. Everybody wanted to chip in for the Wyoming Angel. Outside, a sudden commotion drew their attention. Harrison Cole had stopped counting. He sat back on his heels, his face pale, rubbing his cramped, blackened fingers. He looked at the legal pad where he had been tallying the amounts. He then looked up at Sheriff Boyd and the wall of imposing bikers. "There's a problem," Cole said, his voice cracking. He tried to summon his corporate authority, puffing out his chest. "I have counted the bills and the rolled coins. It comes to exactly $84,300. But the loose change. A lot of these quarters and dimes are heavily tarnished. Some are bent. Bank policy strictly prohibits the acceptance of mutilated currency for official debt settlement. You are $20 short. The eviction stands." The blues guitar stopped abruptly. A heavy, dangerous silence fell over the yard. The low murmur of 1,000 men ceased entirely. The air grew instantly thick with tension. Cole swallowed hard, a drop of cold sweat rolling down his temple despite the freezing temperature. He was terrified, but his bureaucratic arrogance refused to let him lose to a gang of bikers. Big Rick pushed off the kitchen doorframe and walked slowly out onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned under his heavy boots. He stepped right up to the kneeling banker, his shadow completely enveloping Cole. "You're voiding the settlement," Rick rumbled, his voice dangerously low. "Over $20 of scratched quarters?" It is bank policy," Cole stammered, shrinking back. "The debt must be satisfied in full with acceptable tender. I don't make the rules." Sheriff Boyd stood up, shaking his head in disgust. "Harrison, for the love of God, don't be stupid. I've got a 20 in my wallet right now. I'll cover it." "No," Rick interrupted, holding up a massive hand to stop the sheriff. Rick looked out at the sea of leather jackets. He didn't yell. He just nodded once to Snake, who was standing in the front row. Snake grinned, a gold tooth flashing in the afternoon sun. He reached into his denim pocket, pulled out a thick silver money clip, and peeled off a crisp, brand-new $100 bill. He walked up the stairs, stood over Harrison Cole, and dropped the bill directly onto the banker's lap. "Keep the change, suit," Snake sneered. Rick pointed to the clipboard resting on the porch. "Sign the paper, Mr. Cole, before my brothers and I decide we want to make a withdrawal." Cole looked at the $100 bill, then at the 1,000 men glaring at him with unblinking, hostile eyes. The remaining shred of his corporate pride broke completely. His hands shaking violently, he picked up his silver pen and signed his name on the bottom line of the foreclosure release form. He stamped it with his official notary seal. He handed the clipboard to Big Rick. "Get off her property," Rick commanded. Cole scrambled to his feet, not even bothering to brush the dirt off his ruined coat. He grabbed his empty canvas bag and practically sprinted to his black Lincoln Navigator. As he threw it into drive and sped down the long, unpaved driveway, 1,000 heavy motorcycle engines roared to life simultaneously, a deafening, thunderous chorus of mechanical jeers chasing the banker all the way back to the highway. Rick walked back inside the cabin and handed the clipboard to Martha. "It's over, Miss Martha," Rick said gently. "The debt is cleared. The title is free. The house is yours, forever." Martha stared at the signature, the official stamp that proved her nightmare was finally over. The tears came again, but this time there was no sorrow in them. She collapsed into Arthur's rocking chair, holding the clipboard to her chest, sobbing with pure, unadulterated relief. But the Hells Angels were not finished. The $20,000 left over from the canvas bag was not taken back. Over Martha's tearful protests, Big Rick insisted it was hers. "Consider it a roof fund," he said. As the sun began to set, the massive crowd of bikers began to slowly disperse, rumbling away in staggered packs to avoid congesting the interstate. But Rick, Snake, Tommy, and 20 other members of the Wyoming Nomads did not leave. They stayed for the weekend. Over the next 48 hours, the terrifying outlaws transformed into a dedicated construction crew. Snake, who turned out to be a master mechanic, spent a full day under the hood of Martha's rusted 1998 Ford Ranger, replacing the alternator, flushing the fluids, and getting the engine purring like a kitten. Dutch and 3 other massive men climbed onto the roof, replacing the missing shingles that had allowed cold drafts into the attic for years. Tommy and Big Rick took to the woods behind the property with chainsaws, felling 3 dead oak trees. They spent hours swinging heavy axes, chopping a mountain of firewood high enough to keep Martha's wood-burning stove roaring for the next 3 winters. By Sunday evening, the cabin wasn't just saved, it was resurrected. Martha stood on the porch, her arms crossed against the cold, watching the last of the nomads strap their gear onto their bikes. She felt entirely different than she had just 3 days ago. The suffocating loneliness that had haunted her since Arthur's death was completely gone. Big Rick walked up the steps one last time. He didn't offer a handshake. He wrapped his massive arms around the frail, 70-year-old woman in a tight, bear-like hug. "We'll be seeing you, Miss Martha," Rick said, pulling away. "You better," she replied, wagging a stern finger at him. "I expect you boys to stop by whenever you pass through. I know how you all freeze up when the snow hits." Rick laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the Wyoming pines. "You have my word. Nobody rides through Cheyenne without paying their respects to the angel grandmother." They rode off into the fading light, the heavy thrum of their engines, a comforting rhythm against the silence of the plains. Martha walked back inside her home. It was incredibly warm. The fire was roaring, the roof was sealed, and the shadows of debt had been banished. She walked over to the mantel and looked at the framed photo of Arthur. Beside it, resting proudly on a small wooden stand, was the heavy leather-bound club coin the Hells Angels had given her. She reached out and touched it, a soft smile spreading across her face. Arthur had always told her that an act of kindness would circle back to you eventually. He just never warned her that it might arrive on the back of a Harley Davidson, wearing black leather and carrying $80,000 in a duffel bag. For the first time in years, Martha Higgins locked her front door not out of fear, but simply because she was finally safe. Did this incredible true story of unlikely heroes and biker brotherhood give you chills? Sometimes the most terrifying outlaws have the biggest hearts, proving that true angels don't always wear halos. Sometimes they wear leather. If you loved this story, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life stories. Leave a comment below about Big Rick.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of Dominant Flame Escrow. After watching the video, Widow Shelters 20 Freezing Bikers, 1,000 Hells Angels arrive to pay her back, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the unexpected kindness at the center of the story. The widow didn't seem motivated by fear, money, or recognition. She simply saw people struggling in the cold and chose to help. And later, seeing that kindness remembered and returned in such a powerful way gave the story a strong emotional payoff without losing that human feeling underneath it all. Do you think most people would have opened their door in a situation like that, or would fear have stopped them? And why do you think acts of generosity often leave such a lasting impact on people, even years later? I think stories like this remind us that even small moments of compassion can spread much farther than we ever expect. If this story connected with you in some way, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy biker stories filled with loyalty, emotion, and unexpected acts of humanity, feel free to like and subscribe, only if you'd like to see more.